Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I've always thought myself a rational man, logical even. You don't get to work as a geologist in remote regions without having some sense of grounding. The land speaks in layers and sediments, and I was comfortable in its language, interpreting the history of the earth through rock and soil. But what happened last year in the isolated mountains of northern Alaska still haunts me, like a virus that refuses to leave my mind. It started as a routine assignment, or at least I thought it would be. I was to survey a relatively untouched part of the Brooks Range, a stretch of mountains few people ever venture into. My employer, an oil company looking to expand their drilling operations, needed to know if there were any valuable deposits under the surface. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of contributing to environmental destruction, but the paycheck was irresistible, and at 39 years old with no family to speak of, money seemed like a reasonable goal. The trip began without issue. I flew into Fairbanks, then drove up to Coldfoot, a small settlement at the base of the mountains. From there, I'd be dropped off by helicopter to a camp about 30 miles deep into the wilderness. No civilization for days, possibly weeks. The thought excited me more than it frightened me. I'd always been a loner, and the idea of being surrounded by nothing but nature thrilled me. As the helicopter lifted off, the vastness of the landscape hit me. It was like a white and green ocean of jagged peaks and endless forests. Beautiful. Peaceful. When I arrived at the camp, a couple of cabins and a storage shed, left over from a previous survey team, the air was so crisp and clean that it felt like I was breathing for the first time in weeks. The pilot, an older man with a grizzled beard, gave me a word of caution as he helped unload my gear. "You be careful out here, ain't just the bears you gotta worry about." I chuckled and asked what he meant, expecting some local folklore about the wilderness. He didn't answer, just looked at me with that expression people get when they're deciding whether or not to say something they know they probably shouldn't. Eventually, he just waved it off. Just keep your wits about ya. I'll be back in 10 days. With that, he left, and I was alone. The first couple of days were uneventful, filled with the usual routine of setting up equipment, taking samples, and logging notes. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I enjoyed it. The silence of the wilderness was almost therapeutic, the kind that makes you realize how noisy life is in modern society. There were moments, though, when the silence felt different. Not peaceful, but heavy. As though something was pressing down on me, making the air thick and hard to breathe. On the third night I heard it for the first time. A rustling, faint but unmistakable, just beyond the perimeter of the camp. I was inside the cabin, going over my notes when the noise caught my attention. I put down my pen and listened. Nothing. After a few minutes, I chalked it up to the wind or maybe a small animal and got back to work. But then, the following night, it happened again. This time, the sound was more distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate just outside my cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably a bear, though that didn't make me feel any better. I had a rifle, but the idea of confronting a bear in the dark wasn't appealing. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stood up. I waited, straining to hear any further movement. There was nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and went back to bed. I didn't sleep much that night. On the fifth day, I started noticing things were out of place around the camp. Tools I'd left on the table were moved, my backpack was unzipped, and some of my food supplies were missing. I knew I hadn't touched those items, and it was too deliberate to be the work of an animal. Something, or someone, had been here. I searched the surrounding area for tracks, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was unnerving, but not enough to make me leave. I was halfway through the job, and there was no way I was going to let a few odd occurrences stop me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just a hunch or an eerie sensation. I knew there were eyes on me, from somewhere beyond the trees, lurking in the dark. I sat at the table with my rifle beside me, staring out the small cabin window, waiting for something to appear. Hours passed, nothing happened, but the feeling didn't go away. The next morning, I found footprints. Human footprints, leading away from the cabin and into the forest. They weren't mine. They were large, much larger than my own boot prints, and the stride was long, almost unnaturally so. I followed them into the forest for about a quarter of a mile before they just stopped. The ground wasn't rocky or hard. There was no reason for the prints to disappear. But they did, as though whoever, or whatever, had been walking just vanished into thin air. That's when I should have left. But I didn't. I couldn't. I needed to finish the survey. And besides, I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared. So I stayed. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin, over and over slowly. I sat at the table again, rifle in hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear it clearly now. Definitely human, definitely deliberate. But there was something off about it. The footsteps were too even, too steady, as though whoever was making them was walking with a mechanical precision. No animal could move like that. I stood up, moved to the window, and peered outside. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the trees. For a moment I thought I saw movement, something tall and pale, slipping between the trunks. My breath caught in my throat. Then, the footsteps stopped. Silence. A suffocating, heavy silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The following day, I decided to pack up and leave early. Screw the job, screw the paycheck, I wasn't staying here another minute. But as I was gathering my gear, I noticed something strange. My maps were missing. Every single one of them, gone. I searched the cabin, the shed, even the surrounding area, but they were nowhere to be found. Without the maps, I had no way of navigating back to the drop-off point. The terrain out here was unforgiving, and without a guide, I'd be wandering in circles. I tried using my GPS, but it wouldn't turn on. The screen was black, as though the battery had drained overnight. That didn't make sense. I had charged it fully the day before. Panic began to set in. I was alone, with no way to navigate, no way to contact anyone. And something, or someone, was out there, watching me. I spent the rest of the day trying to find my bearings, but every time I ventured out of the camp, I got the distinct impression that I was being followed. I'd hear branches snapping behind me, catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The sun set early in those northern latitudes, and by 6 p.m. it was already getting dark. I retreated to the cabin, bolting the door and barricading it with whatever I could find. I sat in the center of the room, rifle in hand, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin, slower this time, taunting. I heard a soft scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging against the walls. My pulse raced. Then, without warning, there was a knock at the door. 3 loud, deliberate knocks. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tightly my knuckles turned white. The door rattled as if someone, or something, was pressing against it from the other side. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaky. No response. Another knock, harder this time. The door creaked under the pressure. I stood up, backing away from the door, my eyes darting between the window and the walls. The cabin felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. The knocks stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, like breathing, but not quite human. It was coming from just outside the window. Slowly, I turned my head to look, my heart thundering in my chest. And then I saw it. A face, pale, featureless, pressed against the glass. Two dark, sunken eyes stared back at me, cold, empty, and devoid of life. I stumbled backward, dropping the rifle. My vision blurred, and the world spun around me. I heard the door creak open, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps entering the cabin. The last thing I remember before everything went black was those eyes, watching me, unblinking, as the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Fairbanks. A hiker had found me unconscious in the wilderness, miles from where my camp had been. My maps were never found, and the cabin, well, according to the authorities, there was no cabin. No record of any structure existing in that part of the Brooks Range. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there or how I survived. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still feel them. The watchful eyes. My name is Jacob Quinn, and I live in a small town called Iron River, deep in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was 28 when this incident happened to me, and to this day I hesitate to speak of it. The memory still haunts me, the fear still clutches at the back of my mind. What I experienced was unlike anything I had ever imagined. It's not something I like to talk about, but I feel like I need to, if only to keep my sanity. It started on a late autumn day. The kind of cold that creeps under your skin and makes everything feel off-kilter. I had a commission from a wealthy out-of-state client. The project seemed simple enough, a portrait of a house. I'm an artist by trade, and the client had provided me with an old, grainy photograph of a Victorian-era house. It wasn't the kind of art I usually made, but the money was good, and the request seemed straightforward. The only thing the client emphasized, repeatedly, was that I had to replicate the house exactly as it appeared in the photograph. No alterations. I remember thinking it was an odd request, but I didn't question it. I should have. That day, I was on my way from Iron River to Marquette to pick up some art supplies I needed for the final details. The drive would usually take around 2 hours, and as soon as I hit the road, I noticed the weather was turning. Snowflakes began to fall, at first gently, then thick and heavy. The kind of snow that makes the world feel smaller, like it's closing in around you. The road ahead was barely visible, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. I hadn't been able to shake the strange feeling I'd had ever since I started working on the painting. The house in the photograph. There was something off about it. At first, I chalked it up to my own mind playing tricks on me. Spending hours staring at a single image could do that to anyone. But as the days went on, I began to notice things. Subtle changes in the shadows, odd shapes in the windows that hadn't been there before. At one point, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a face peering out from behind the curtains in one of the upper windows. But I'd always brush it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I was about halfway to Marquette when my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen, seeing a text from the client. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't contacted me much during the process, and I wasn't expecting to hear from him now. "Have you finished the face yet?" The words made me shiver, though I couldn't explain why. The painting was of a house, not a person. There was no face. I hadn't been asked to paint a face. My mind raced, but I told myself it was just a mistake. A typo, maybe. I tried to push the unease down and focus on the road, but the snow was coming down harder now, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. A few minutes passed, and then my phone buzzed again. "Finish the face." I pulled over, the snow crunching under the tires as I came to a stop. My heart was pounding in my chest as I grabbed the phone, reading the message again. My hands felt cold, my breath visible in the car's interior. I typed a quick response. "What face?" I waited for a reply, but none came. I stared at the screen, the silence around me suddenly deafening. The wind howled outside, the snow piling up against the windows. I looked down at the photograph of the house, sitting next to me in the passenger seat. It was the same as always, faded, grainy, unassuming. But as I stared at it, I noticed something I hadn't before. In one of the upper windows, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a face. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. I blinked hard, trying to shake the image from my mind. There was no face. There couldn't be. I'd been staring at that photo for weeks. How could I have missed something like that? The engine sputtered as I turned the key, and I cursed under my breath. The snow was falling faster now, heavier, and I knew I needed to get moving before the road became impassable. But that face, it was burned into my mind. I couldn't stop seeing it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The car finally roared to life, and I pulled back onto the road, the tires skidding slightly on the snow-covered pavement. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get to Marquette, get my supplies, and finish this painting. I needed to get it out of my life. As I drove, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the client. "It's watching." My stomach turned. I didn't know what to do, what to think. The messages made no sense. What was watching? Why was he talking about a face? I sped up, pushing through the snowstorm, desperate to reach civilization, to escape the eerie isolation of the road. But the messages didn't stop. One after another they came, each one more cryptic, more terrifying than the last. "Don't look at it. Finish the face. It's too late." By the time I reached Marquette, I was shaking. I parked the car outside the art supply store and sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't look at it. I couldn't. I grabbed the photograph from the passenger seat, holding it up to the light, trying to understand what I was seeing. The face in the window was clearer now. It wasn't just a vague shape or a trick of the light. It was real, detailed. Eyes, nose, mouth, all there, staring out from the shadows of the house. I dropped the photograph, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I had to be losing my mind. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The snow had eased up by the time I left Marquette, but the unease stayed with me. I drove back to Iron River in silence, my mind racing. The messages, the face, the strange requests from the client. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I got home, I went straight to the garage where the painting sat, half finished, covered with a sheet. I hesitated for a moment before pulling the sheet away, revealing the canvas beneath. The house stared back at me, just as it had before. But something was different now. The windows seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and in the top right window, I could see it. Faint, but there. The face. I stumbled back, my heart racing. It was the same face I'd seen in the photograph, the same one the client had been asking about. But how? How could it have appeared in the painting when I hadn't put it there? I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the messages. There were dozens of them now, all from the client, all telling me to finish the face, to not look at it, to beware of what was coming. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to burn the painting, to get rid of it once and for all. But something stopped me. A feeling, a whisper in the back of my mind, telling me that destroying it wouldn't be enough. The face was watching, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. Days passed, and the messages kept coming. Every night I heard noises, whispers, footsteps, the creak of floorboards. I would wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, convinced that someone or something was in the room with me. But every time I turned on the lights, the room was empty. I stopped working on the painting. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, let alone finish it. But the face was still there, watching, waiting. I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. I had to do something. One night, after days of sleeplessness, I decided to confront it. I went into the garage, stood in front of the painting, and stared at the face in the window. It was clearer now, more defined. The eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, the mouth twisted into a silent scream. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I picked up the brush and began to paint. I don't remember much of what happened after that. It was like I was in a trance, my hand moving on its own, adding details to the face, bringing it to life. When I finally stepped back, the face was complete. It stared back at me from the canvas, no longer a part of the house, but something else, something alive. And then I heard it. A scream. Not from the painting, but from inside the house. The same scream I'd heard on the road that night, the same scream that had haunted my dreams. I dropped the brush and ran, leaving the painting behind. I haven't been back to the garage since. I can't. Every time I get close, I hear that scream again, echoing through the walls. I don't know what I've unleashed, but I know one thing for certain. The face is watching, and it won't stop until it finds me. I should have left it where I found it, I know that now. But the human mind, my mind, isn't wired to resist curiosity. And that's how I found myself in the basement of my grandmother's old house, standing in front of an ancient dust-covered wooden box. I had been helping my parents clear out her house after she passed. It was one of those enormous old New England homes, full of history, cobwebs, and secrets. The basement was the last place we were supposed to clean, and it hadn't been touched in years. The light bulb flickered when I turned it on, casting weak, sickly yellow light over the stone walls and decaying floorboards. That's when I saw it. The box was wedged between a crumbling wall and an old, rotting bookshelf. It wasn't big, just about the size of a small suitcase. The wood was dark and smooth, but covered in intricate carvings that had faded with time. As I wiped the dust from its surface, a chill ran through me. I don't know why I felt it, a kind of foreboding, like I was on the edge of something I didn't understand. But instead of stopping, I opened it. Inside was a single object, a mirror. Small, square, and framed in silver. It was old, obviously antique, and yet the glass itself was perfect, clear as day. No scratches, no signs of age. That was the first red flag. The second? When I looked into the mirror, I didn't see my reflection. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. I turned the mirror this way and that, but the glass remained stubbornly empty. No reflection, just a blank, cold surface staring back at me. I set it down, but something was wrong. My skin crawled, the hair on the back of my neck standing up as if someone was watching me. But there was no one else in the basement. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably some old heirloom of my grandmother's, something forgotten and tucked away like most of the things in this house. I shoved the mirror back into the box and continued cleaning, but the unease didn't leave me. As I worked through the piles of old clothes and knickknacks, I could feel something behind me, watching, waiting. Every now and then, I'd glance at the box, now shut tight in the corner, and that same cold sensation would crawl up my spine. I should have left it there, but I didn't. That night, I took the mirror home. Don't ask me why. I didn't have a reason, other than some morbid curiosity. It was beautiful in its own way, and I thought maybe it would be worth something. Besides, there was nothing supernatural about an old piece of glass, right? But when I got home, the feeling followed me. My small apartment felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I set the box down on the kitchen table, trying to shake off the growing unease. I sat down in front of it, hands resting on the edge of the box, staring at it like it might move. And that's when I heard it. A voice. Soft, almost too quiet to hear, like it was coming from far away. I froze, straining my ears to listen. At first it was just a whisper, unintelligible. Then it became clearer, a woman's voice, soft but insistent. She was calling my name. Come closer. I leaped up, nearly knocking the chair over, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else in the apartment. I was alone. The voice had come from the box, or the mirror inside it. I didn't open it again that night. I shoved the box into the closet, slammed the door shut, and turned on every light in the house. But the voice, it didn't stop. All night I could hear it, faintly, just on the edge of hearing, whispering, beckoning. The next day I tried to convince myself that I was just tired. My grandmother had died, the house was stressful, and I was probably just imagining things. But the voices wouldn't go away. They got louder. By the second night, I could make out entire sentences. She wasn't just calling my name anymore, she was pleading, begging for something I didn't understand. When I finally opened the box again, I did it out of desperation. Maybe if I understood what this thing was, I could stop whatever was happening. I grabbed the mirror and stared into it, demanding to see something, anything that would make sense. At first, it was still blank. No reflection, just the cold, empty glass. But then, slowly, something began to take shape in the surface. Not me, something else. Something watching. Eyes. Pale, hollow eyes, staring back at me from within the mirror. They blinked, and my breath caught in my throat. The eyes were human. No, more than human. They were alive. They were aware of me. I dropped the mirror and stumbled back, my heart slamming in my chest. But when I picked it up again, the eyes were gone. Just the empty glass once more. But I knew what I had seen. There was something inside that mirror, something alive, and it was looking back at me. The next day, I did some research. I dug through old records, trying to find out anything about the mirror or the box, or why my grandmother would have kept it hidden for so long. But there was nothing. No mentions of it in her possessions, no photographs, no records. It was as if the box had never existed. Desperate, I contacted an antiques expert I knew. A friend of a friend, someone who dealt in the strange and unusual. When I showed him the mirror, he went pale. "I've seen this before," he said quietly, turning it over in his hands. "Not this exact one, but ones like it." He told me that mirrors like this weren't mirrors at all. They were traps, windows. They didn't show reflections because they weren't meant to. They were meant to show what was on the other side. "The other side?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded. "There are things, creatures, that live beyond our reality. Sometimes they break through, usually through objects, mirrors in particular. They wait on the other side, watching, waiting for someone to notice them." I stared at the mirror in his hands, my stomach twisting in knots. "They're called the unseen," he continued, his voice low. "They exist just beyond our perception, always there but hidden. But once you've seen them, they won't leave you alone." I felt sick. I knew, deep down, that whatever was in that mirror had already seen me, and it was coming closer. The voices grew louder after that. Every night the woman's voice called to me, pleading, begging. I stopped sleeping. I stopped leaving the apartment. All I could do was sit, clutching the mirror, waiting for something to happen. And then, one night, it did. I was sitting in the dark, the mirror on the table in front of me, the box discarded on the floor. The room felt heavy, oppressive, like the air had thickened. The voice was louder than ever, insistent, angry, and then the eyes appeared again. This time they didn't blink. They stared at me, unblinking, unfeeling, from the surface of the mirror. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, paralyzed, as if the mirror itself had me in its grip. Then the glass rippled. Slowly, the surface shifted, like water, and the eyes moved closer. The mirror wasn't just a window anymore. It was a doorway. Something was coming through. I screamed, throwing the mirror across the room. It hit the wall and shattered, the glass exploding into 1,000 tiny pieces. For a moment, there was silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. But then I heard it again, the whispering. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from the shards of glass scattered across the floor. I don't know how I made it through the night. I stayed huddled in the corner of my apartment, staring at the broken pieces of the mirror. The voices didn't stop. They never stopped. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, until it felt like they were pressing against my skull, trying to break in. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out, had to leave before whatever was on the other side came through completely. I packed a bag and fled in the middle of the night, not even bothering to lock the door behind me, but it doesn't matter. I know it's still following me. Wherever I go, I hear the voices, soft at first, then louder, closer. Every time I pass a mirror, I see those eyes staring at me from the other side, watching, waiting. I can't escape it. I've seen the unseen, and now they've seen me, and they'll never let me go. I still don't know why I stopped there. It was past midnight, and I was driving through an endless stretch of highway somewhere between Colorado and Utah, when my fuel gauge blinked dangerously low. I hadn't seen a sign of life for miles, and the desert was starting to swallow the road beneath me. There wasn't supposed to be a gas station for at least another 50 miles. Yet, when I crested a small hill, there it was. A gas station, like something out of a bad dream. The lights flickered weakly, and the sign above the station was so worn and sun-bleached that I couldn't make out a name. Only gas remained, with the G hanging at an awkward angle. It looked old, like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Maybe older. The pumps were the ancient, manual kind, the ones with mechanical dials instead of digital readouts. The place felt out of place, like it had been forgotten by time. I pulled in, more out of desperation than anything else. My car's engine was already sputtering, and I wasn't about to risk being stranded in the desert overnight. But the second I killed the engine, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. No one was inside the small convenience store attached to the station. The glass door swung open and shut with a creak as the wind passed through, rattling a little bell above it. A dim light flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked concrete. The whole place looked deserted, but something told me it wasn't. I looked around, my skin prickling with unease. There were no other cars in sight, no sign of life anywhere. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was low on gas and the nearest town was too far away. Besides, it's just a gas station, I told myself. People come and go. Maybe the attendants in the back are taking a nap. I stepped out of the car, the heat still clinging to the night air even though the sun had long set. The faint hum of insects buzzed somewhere in the distance. A chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something was off here. As I approached the pump, I noticed it was covered in dust, like no one had used it in years. I wiped my hand across the glass window of the dials, clearing away the grime. The numbers stared back at me, stuck at 0. I tried to lift the nozzle, but it was stiff, almost rusted in place. There was no way this thing was working. Frustrated, I glanced back at the convenience store. Maybe I had to pay inside first, but the windows were dark and I didn't see anyone moving inside. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. The bell jingled softly as I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was musty and thick, like the smell of rotting wood and something metallic. The shelves were half empty, stocked with products I didn't even recognize, brands that seemed like relics from another era. Dust covered everything. A single flickering fluorescent light hung from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the small, silent space. No answer. I approached the counter, expecting to find an old, grizzled attendant asleep in a chair. But there was no one. Just an old, rusted cash register and a thick layer of dust. A strange, gnawing feeling started to build in my chest. This place hadn't been open for a long time. I turned to leave when something caught my eye. A door, half hidden behind a shelf of dusty canned goods. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light seeped through the crack. Maybe someone was back there. I hesitated, every part of me screaming to get out, but my feet moved on their own. As I approached the door, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were deep, dark scratches gouged into the wood near the handle, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way out. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the door. It creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan. Beyond it was a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were lined with old photographs, their frames crooked and covered in dust. I squinted at them as I moved down the hall. The pictures were black and white, showing a series of faces. People, all standing in front of this very gas station. But their eyes... Something was wrong with their eyes. They were too wide, too dark, as if the photographer had captured them in the middle of a scream. I hurried past them, my heart pounding in my chest. The hall seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, and the air grew colder with each step I took. Finally, I reached the end, where another door stood, this one heavy and made of metal. It looked out of place, as if it belonged in a bunker, not a convenience store. I didn't want to open it. Every nerve in my body told me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't stop. My hand reached for the cold handle, and with a slow, trembling breath, I pulled it open. Behind that door was something I will never forget. The room was small and bare except for a single chair in the center. On it sat a man, if you could even call him that anymore. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched thin over his bones. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on the door as if he had been waiting for me. But that wasn't the worst part. His mouth was open in a silent scream, frozen in a grotesque expression of terror. His hands were clamped around the arms of the chair, his knuckles white and his fingers bent in unnatural angles. He had been dead for a long time, yet there was something disturbingly lifelike about him, as if he could spring up at any moment. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. As I did, I noticed something written on the wall behind him, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "It watches." I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those words, before I finally snapped out of it. My survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted. I raced down the hall, past the eerie photographs and back into the convenience store. But as I reached the front door, something stopped me, the sound of footsteps. They weren't behind me but ahead of me, coming from outside. I froze, my hand on the door, heart hammering in my chest. I peeked through the glass, and what I saw nearly made me scream. There was a man standing next to my car. He was tall and lanky, dressed in dirty overalls, with a trucker hat pulled low over his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and he moved in slow, deliberate motions as he inspected the front of my car. I couldn't see his eyes beneath the brim of the hat, but I could feel him watching me. Something wasn't right about him. He wasn't natural. Every fiber of my being screamed that this wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that had taken on a human form. I backed away from the door, praying he hadn't seen me. Then, without warning, the lights in the gas station flickered out. Panic surged through me. I stumbled through the darkness, trying to find my way back to the counter, to anything that could serve as a weapon. But as I groped around, my hand brushed something cold, something that wasn't there before. I looked down and saw it. A key, old and rusty, just lying there on the counter as if someone had placed it there for me. I had no idea what it unlocked, but I grabbed it without thinking. Suddenly, the door to the gas station creaked open. My breath caught in my throat. The man, if he even was a man, stood silhouetted in the doorway, motionless. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I bolted toward the back, through the narrow hallway and into the room with the dead man. There was no way out, no windows, no escape. But as I stood there, trapped, I realized what the key was for. The chair. There was a small rusted lock at its base, hidden beneath the dead man's feet. My hands trembled as I crouched down and inserted the key. It clicked open with a loud, echoing sound. The moment the lock released, the man in the chair let out a long, ragged breath. I don't remember what happened after that. All I know is that I woke up in my car, miles away from the gas station. My tank was full, but I have no memory of filling it. I've never gone back. But sometimes, late at night, I see headlights in my rearview mirror, and I know it's still watching. It always will. I never believed in those old stories about the woods. Ghosts, creatures, the things people claim to see when they're out camping. It all seemed ridiculous. But after what happened to me last fall, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the wilderness again. It started when my friend Greg suggested a camping trip. Greg was always the outdoorsy type, the kind of guy who'd pack up his tent and head into the mountains without a second thought. Me? Not so much. I preferred my weekends indoors, away from bugs, bears, and whatever else lurked out there. But Greg was persuasive, and I hadn't seen him in months, so I agreed. We planned to camp at a place called Briarwood Campground, about 3 hours outside of Seattle, deep in the Olympic National Forest. Greg had been there once before, years ago, and said it was perfect. Isolated, peaceful, right by a lake. "You'll love it," he said, and against my better judgment, I trusted him. We left on a Friday afternoon, driving through winding mountain roads as the sky slowly darkened. The deeper we got into the forest, the fewer cars we saw, until eventually, it was just us and the towering trees on either side. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, but I chalked it up to nerves. I wasn't used to the outdoors after all. It was already dusk by the time we arrived at Briarwood. The campground was deserted. Not another car or camper in sight. The trees were so thick that they blocked out most of the remaining daylight, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The silence was unsettling, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Greg didn't seem bothered. He pulled the car into a clearing and started unloading the gear. I helped, though my eyes kept drifting toward the woods. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "This place looks old," I muttered, glancing at the crumbling fire pit and the worn-down picnic table. "It's probably just been a while since anyone's camped here," Greg said with a shrug. "That's the beauty of it. No crowds, no noise. We've got the whole place to ourselves." I wasn't sure I liked that. We set up camp quickly. Greg handled the tent while I gathered some firewood. The sun was almost gone by the time we got a fire going, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the cool night air, and the silence felt even heavier now, broken only by the occasional crack of wood in the fire. As we sat around the fire, Greg started telling stories. Most of them were about his past camping trips, close encounters with wildlife, that sort of thing. But eventually the conversation drifted to local legends. "You ever heard of the Briarwood Witch?" he asked, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. I snorted. "Come on, man. Don't start with that crap." "No, seriously," he insisted. "It's an old legend around here. Supposedly, there was a woman who lived in these woods back in the early 1900s. People in the nearby towns said she was a witch, that she did black magic or something. The story goes that she was responsible for a bunch of disappearances. Kids, hikers, even whole families would go missing in these woods, and they'd say it was her doing." I rolled my eyes. "And what? She cursed the woods or something?" Greg leaned in, his voice low. "They say her spirit still haunts this forest. People who camp here, they hear things, see things, and some never come back." I laughed, though it sounded more nervous than amused. "Nice try. You're not scaring me, man." Greg smirked and leaned back, satisfied with planting the seed of doubt in my mind. We talked a bit more, but the atmosphere had shifted. The fire was burning lower now, casting strange shadows on the trees around us, and the silence of the woods felt heavier, more oppressive. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. Greg crawled into the tent first, and I followed, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been growing in the pit of my stomach. The wind rustled through the trees, but it sounded strange, like whispers carried on the breeze. I tried to ignore it, but sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why, but then I realized the fire had gone out. The woods were pitch black, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Greg was fast asleep next to me, snoring softly. But something else was wrong. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the silence. The woods, which had been full of the usual sounds, wind, insects, the occasional rustle in the bushes, were now completely still. Unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I strained to listen, but the more I tried, the more the silence pressed in on me, like a weight in my chest. And then I heard it, a soft, barely audible sound, like someone whispering just outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. It was faint but unmistakable, voices. Low, breathy, too quiet to make out the words, but they were there. Someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I held my breath, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Greg's stupid story about the witch had gotten into my head. That was all. I wasn't about to wake him up and look like an idiot over some wind or animal noises. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, more insistent, though still too soft to understand. My mind raced. Maybe it was other campers. Maybe they'd arrived late and were setting up nearby. But then why would they be whispering? I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just a fraction and peered out. The campground was empty. There was no one there. Just darkness and trees, and the cold night air biting at my face. I looked around, trying to find the source of the whispers, but the moment I opened the tent, they stopped. The silence was back, deeper and more suffocating than before. I shut the tent quickly, my hands trembling. My heart was racing now, every instinct telling me something was very wrong. I shook Greg awake. "Hey man, something's out there," I whispered urgently. Greg groaned, half asleep. "What are you talking about?" "I heard voices," I insisted. "There's someone out there." Greg sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Voices? Seriously?" "Yes, I don't know. Maybe other campers or..." But before I could finish, we both heard it. A faint, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It was distant but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the woods behind us. Greg's expression changed instantly. He wasn't laughing anymore. We sat there, listening, the air in the tent growing colder. The sound was getting closer, slow and deliberate, like whatever was making it didn't care if we heard it. "Pack up," Greg whispered, his voice tight with fear. "We're leaving. Now." We scrambled to gather our things, throwing everything haphazardly into our bags. The dragging sound continued, closer now, and the whispers had started up again, low and insistent, coming from every direction. As we unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the air was colder than it should have been, a biting chill that cut through our clothes. The fire pit was nothing but cold ash, and the trees seemed darker, as if the shadows had deepened. Greg turned on his flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the darkness. The woods seemed to swallow the light. We hurried to the car, and that's when we saw it. Just beyond the clearing, at the edge of the woods, there was a figure. It stood completely still, shrouded in shadow, barely visible in the weak light of Greg's flashlight. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, standing there, watching us. "Get in the car," Greg hissed. We fumbled with the doors, throwing our bags into the back seat as quickly as we could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my seatbelt on. Greg started the engine, but it sputtered and died. "Come on," he muttered, turning the key again. The engine roared to life, and he slammed the car into reverse, peeling out of the clearing and back onto the dirt road. I looked out the window, my heart in my throat, but the figure was gone. For the next 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional thud as we hit a pothole. The whispers had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like the forest was watching us, waiting. Finally, we reached the highway, the lights of civilization far in the distance. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Greg shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know, man. I don't know." We never spoke about that night again. I haven't been camping since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers. And I remember that figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. And I know that whatever's out there, it hasn't forgotten me. I never believed in the devil, at least not in the traditional sense. To me, hell was just a concept designed to scare people into submission, and sin was just a word to make you feel guilty for wanting something. My name is David Pierce, and I'm 31 years old. A native of St. Paul, Minnesota, I've lived a pretty standard life. There's nothing particularly remarkable about me, just another face in a sea of mundane lives. Everything changed last summer. I've always been into puzzles, riddles, and mind games. Something about cracking a difficult problem gave me an immense sense of satisfaction. So when a friend of mine, Carl, invited me to an exclusive underground game in a remote town in North Dakota, I was intrigued. He didn't say much over the phone, only that it was a rare opportunity to win an absurd amount of money. All I had to do was outwit the other contestants. He made it sound simple, too simple. But my curiosity got the better of me. The trip to the town was an arduous 5-hour drive from St. Paul. When I arrived, the place looked deserted, like a ghost town. The few people I saw on the streets kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact as if they didn't want to be noticed. I should have turned back right then, but something in me, maybe the hunger for a challenge or the allure of an enormous cash prize, made me stay. The venue Carl directed me to was a large, dilapidated mansion at the edge of town. A monstrous thing, standing tall and oppressive, its windows dark and hollow. The kind of place you'd expect in a Gothic novel, abandoned and rumored to be haunted. It creaked ominously as I pushed open the door, and I instantly regretted my decision to come. Carl greeted me in the foyer, looking a little too excited. He was the kind of guy who lived for thrills, always chasing after the next big adrenaline rush. But there was something off about his demeanor, an unsettling gleam in his eyes. "You made it," he said, clapping me on the back. "You're going to love this." He led me to a grand ballroom where several other participants were gathered. There were 8 of us in total, all strangers, standing awkwardly around a massive circular table. At the center of the table sat a peculiar object, an old ornate box with intricate carvings on its surface. It looked ancient, like it didn't belong in this world. And from the moment I laid eyes on it, an overwhelming sense of dread settled in my gut. A man in a dark suit appeared from the shadows, his face obscured by the dim lighting. He introduced himself as the Game Master. His voice was low, gravelly, with a slight accent I couldn't place. He explained the rules in a cold, detached manner, as if he had recited them hundreds of times before. The box, he said, was the centerpiece of the game. Each of us would take turns opening it. Inside was a deck of cards, each card representing a challenge or a consequence. Most were simple, trivial tasks or harmless forfeits. But a few, he warned, were deadly. "We call it the Devil's Game," he said, a sinister smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "The game has one rule: you must play until the box is empty." "What happens if we refuse?" someone asked, a tall man standing across from me. The game master's eyes darkened. Refusal is not an option. There was no backing out. It became clear that we had all been lured here, not by the promise of money, but by something far more malevolent. And now we were trapped. The first player, a nervous-looking woman named Stephanie, was called to draw a card. Her hand trembled as she opened the box and pulled one out. The card read, "Share a personal secret." Her eyes darted around the room and she hesitated. Finally, she confessed to cheating on her husband. The tension in the room thickened, but nothing happened. No punishment, no retribution. We all sighed in relief. Next was Carl's turn. He grinned confidently, reaching into the box and pulling out a card. Sing a song. Carl belted out an off-key rendition of some pop song, clearly relieved that his task was easy. We even laughed a little, easing the tension for a brief moment. Then it was my turn. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I opened the box. My fingers brushed against the deck, and a sharp jolt of electricity shot through my hand. I winced, but pulled a card anyway. It read, "Stay silent for the next 2 rounds." I breathed a sigh of relief. Not bad. I could handle silence. But as the game progressed, the tasks became darker. One man was forced to eat a raw rat, still squirming, while another was commanded to break one of his own fingers with a hammer provided by the game master. Blood pooled on the table as his screams echoed through the ballroom. The atmosphere grew colder, more sinister. It was as if the mansion itself was alive, feeding on our fear. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering and twisting into grotesque shapes. I could hear whispers, soft, unintelligible voices coming from the box. By the time it was my turn again, my heart was pounding in my chest. The others were visibly shaken, some sobbing quietly. I drew my card with trembling hands, terrified of what it might say. Play the devil's game. I stared at the words, confused. Wasn't that what we were already doing? The game master stepped forward, his smile widening as if he had been waiting for this moment. "The real game begins now," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Suddenly the lights dimmed and the room plunged into darkness. The only source of light came from the box, which now glowed with an eerie red hue. The temperature dropped drastically, and I could see my breath in front of me. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the room, inhuman, ancient. "Do you accept the challenge?" it asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was a command. My mind screamed at me to say no, to run. But I was frozen in place, unable to speak, unable to move. Slowly, I nodded. The voice laughed, a low, rumbling sound that shook the very foundations of the mansion. "Good." The box burst open, and something emerged from it. A black, swirling mass of shadows, twisting and writhing like a living nightmare. It had no form, no face, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, piercing, malevolent. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The voice hissed in my ear, though the shadowy figure remained across the table. "Your soul," it said simply. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like icy claws gripping my heart. I gasped, clutching at my shirt. But there was no escape. The others were screaming now, running for the doors, but the mansion wouldn't let them leave. The windows slammed shut, the doors locked tight. We were prisoners in this hellish game, and there was no way out. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. "It's your turn, David," the voice said. "Make your move." I looked down at the table, where the deck of cards still lay. The top card had my name on it. With trembling hands, I flipped it over. "Sacrifice another player to save yourself." My stomach dropped. I looked around the room at the terrified faces of the others. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't. But the pressure in my chest grew more intense, and the shadow loomed over me, waiting. "Choose," it demanded. "I can't." I whispered. The shadow snarled, and I felt something cold wrap around my throat, tightening, choking the life out of me. My vision blurred, and I thought I was going to die right there. But then Carl stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "I'll do it," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll play for David." The shadow paused, as if considering the offer. Then, slowly, it retreated, its grip on me loosening. Carl took a deep breath and reached for the deck. He drew his card, his hands shaking. It read, "Face your greatest fear." He paled, his eyes widening in terror. "No, no, I can't." But it was too late. The shadows engulfed him, pulling him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the mansion, and then silence. The box snapped shut, and the voice whispered one final word in my ear. "Run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, which now swung open as if the mansion itself was letting me go. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I never looked back. I never saw Carl again. To this day, I don't know what happened to him or to the others who played that night. All I know is that I survived the devil's game, but not without a cost. That box, it still haunts my nightmares. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that voice again. "Play the game, David, it's your turn." But I know one thing for certain. I'll never play again.